Okay. Thank you, everyone. We will arrive now to the last part of our meeting. And during the first part this morning, we discussed many things about the approach of risk reduction in the French context. This last part of our meeting is, in fact, an invitation to put into perspective the reflection that we have during the last minute into the light of the international experience. So it's therefore my great pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Scott Knowles. Scott Knowles is Senior Director of Research for the Defense Industrial Base Institute and research professor as well in the Department of History of Northeastern University. He is a historian of disaster, and his work focuses mainly on the processes that make disaster possible. But also he works a lot about the issue of the application of history and public policy to reduce future disasters. He is the author and the editor of so many books. I will only mention 6 books that he published until now. Not so much, so near. And as well, he's founding co-editor of the Journal of Disaster Studies that launched in fall 2023. So, Scott, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Okay, there we go. Perfect. Bonjour. And thus ends the French part of my presentation. So I hope you can tolerate my English, and thank you for this terrific invitation to be here with you, and sorry to shorten your coffee break. I want to also just acknowledge how thrilling it is to see so many younger scholars, the next generation of disaster researchers here today. Thank you all for taking time away from your book writing and dissertation writing to be here in this presentation. How do you tell the story of COVID? And I mean you, individually, each person. Think for a second, how do you tell the story? Are you thinking about it in terms of quantities, numbers, qualities, stories, memories, technology? Where is your story located? This is one way to tell the story. A photograph of iPads in a break room in a hospital in the United States, iPads that were used for goodbye conversations between those who were dying and their families who were not allowed into the hospital to say goodbye to them in person. This is a way of telling the story of COVID through absence. Maybe this is the way that more of us are used to understanding COVID, and we got very used to these kinds of graphics very quickly. I think people became armchair epidemiologists. The amount of data that was coming in, of course, was overwhelming. This is up to date as of 2 weeks ago. It's no longer considered an epidemic, but people are still dying around the world from COVID. Here's another way, though, to tell the story. And I'll give you just a second to look at it, because it takes a little time and contemplation. It's not linear. It's not even oriented horizontally. But it has form and color and number and meaning. There will be some text on my slides. I'm a historian. I'm required to put a lot of text on my slides. I'm sorry about that. This is from my interview in 2022 with Gonzalo Bacigalupe. Gonzalo is a psychiatrist, public health researcher, disaster researcher, and painter from Chile. He's based in Boston. He goes back and forth between Santiago and Boston. I interviewed him in April of 2022. I can't believe it's been 4 years. During the pandemic, to keep my own sanity, I did a podcast every day. I did 500 interviews over 2 years in a project called COVID Calls. And in my interview with Gonzalo, he introduced to me what he had been doing to keep his own mental health and a practice that he had developed to try to develop a mode of memorial for a disaster in Chile and like the rest of the world where the names were not easily known, but the numbers were being reported constantly. And he felt overwhelmed by the numbers, and so he described that he started to just write down the numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then he started painting them. And this for him was a practice to acknowledge the reality of what was happening, a form of communication between himself and people who were gone, but he wanted to honor them. And then he started setting these numbers on backgrounds, on canvases. And this this is an enormous canvas, actually, I think 8 feet high. And so he did very small works, and he also did very large works, but the writing out of the number to Gonzalo was really crucial. How do you tell the story of the Sewol ferry disaster? Maybe you've never heard of the Sewol ferry disaster. And so maybe I'm introducing it to you here for the first time. April 16th, 2014. A ferry boat leaves Incheon, South Korea, on its way to Jeju Island. Most of the people on board are high school students, juniors, on their way to Jeju for their high school trip. And the boat sank off of the southern coast of South Korea. 304 passengers and crew were killed. 250 of them were high school students from the Danwon High School in Ansan. This is a way to tell the story. It's a pretty common way. These are the photographs that news media can get from helicopters. You may notice here, if you know anything about this disaster, the rescue was complete failure. Almost no one was rescued from this, even though rescue was possible. And that question still hangs in the air in South Korea. Why was the rescue a failure? How had the government failed? Why had the risk not been perceived or managed effectively? These are the kinds of questions that we all traffic in when we think about risk. But let me suggest another way to think. Maybe your story of Sewol starts with the bereaved families, not with the disaster or the sinking of the ship at all, but with the actions taken by the bereaved families after to demand justice in many forms. And so if your story starts there, you will document their path, which began by shaving their heads, sitting in the Gwanghwamun Square in the center of Seoul and not leaving, setting up a permanent encampment, and then collecting hundreds of thousands of signatures across the country stored in these yellow boxes that you see of citizens demanding an investigation. The moral authority of the bereaved parent demanding a technical investigation, which they got. And they created this, the memory classroom. And if I leave you with nothing else today, I hope you will go to Ansan, South Korea, and go to the memory classroom and have the experience of being in the actual classroom. They took 19 of the classrooms from the Danwon High School because those students never came back. They disassembled the classrooms, chair by chair, blackboard by blackboard, clock by clock, ceiling screw by ceiling screw, and they transported them to another place where they mounted them, where you can now go into these 19 classrooms, and each chair and each desk is a living tribute to those who died. It's another way to tell that story of a disaster. And I introduce you to a second person now, Ji-sung Lee, or how she usually introduces herself as the mother of Do-won Kim, an activist who learned her activism literally in the worst moment of her life, an archivist who's learned her trade and craft over the last 12 years, and now a museum expert. And I won't call her a politician, but she's a political strategist. Like Gonzalo, in a moment of grief, she reached for the things that she had hold of as a non-expert, but a person with enormous power and creativity to craft a story about risk and disaster. So I start in this way to briefly show you how I think about the challenge of characterizing risk and disaster. And maybe approaching it this way is a little bit out of the norm, or maybe not what you usually use in terms of your methods. although if you're an anthropologist in this room, maybe you're already using these methods. And I've brought you a couple of international cases to think with. And I'm going to talk now about practices I use that you might find interesting, particularly dealing with how we manage time and memory and participatory action research. It's a fancy phrase for mutual aid or working together with stakeholders. And you all already know this, but I just want to linger here for a second to say that no matter the data you choose, you have to put it in time and space, and you have to animate it with the actors that you want to shine light on. And part of this effort, as I understand it, in the PEPR risk is to think hard about those scales and those people and what that inclusivity looks like. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about practices that I use. So time and disaster. The term, I mean, I'm imposing it in English on you, and you can reject that, and you can think about whatever languages you're familiar or comfortable with. The Anglophone hegemony of disaster language in the research space is bothersome, I think, but it's the only tool I have. The bounding of disaster in time is a profoundly political act. That is to say, it's the exertion of power, and many people are doing it. At any moment, you have your own concept of time and disaster. Here's how emergency managers are taught in the United States to think about time. Disaster is a cycle, and it moves through phases. Mitigation, right? Those things that you do to manage risk and ahead of time. Preparedness, the actual steps you take once you've mitigated the disaster. Response, this is where 99% of funding goes in the United States in disaster. It's helicopters, it's sandbags, it's food, it's housing, although less and less available all the time, but this is where most of it goes. And then recovery. And you notice that at least there's some element of real core existential truth in the way emergency managers think about time. They're just going in circles and circles and circles. There's no way out of this. Mary Dudziak's tremendous book, Wartime, first of all, she makes the important move of characterizing war as disaster, which I agree with entirely. And talking about wartime as another frame of time that powerful people use to expediently allow certain kinds of risk-taking that they might not otherwise. In moments of crisis, and this is not an original idea necessarily, it's a very old idea, taking advantage of the crisis, looking in the crisis to accomplish other political aims. War has always been, I think in the United States and probably around the world, a sort of special time out of mind where policymakers have special authority. I spend a lot of time thinking about a concept called slow disaster. You might also be familiar with the term slow violence, which Rob Nixon has written about. And it's really, in some fundamental way, it's just an attempt to draw our attention to the temporal claims of disaster and to think about disaster as an ongoing process rather than an event. But also, if you think of it slightly differently, I want to slow it. I want to slow down your disaster apprehension. I want us to not rush to judgments, but actually build a process and a structure that allows us to take a disaster event, build its foreground, think about the event, and then build its aftermath, and then maintain that level of analysis over long periods of time. And I think there's good analytical reasons to do this, but I think there's also good humanitarian reasons to do this. The ways that I included you in this, I'm sorry. The ways that I have often talked about disaster, I think can be actually quite harmful to bereaved families, to survivors and their communities. And this is an old problem, but a real problem, that when experts arrive, we are there to solve the problem, right? That's what we're good at. But the problem we're there to solve may not be the problem that the stakeholder in the community wants us to solve. It can create extra problems. And so I think a slow disaster methodology is one that acknowledges, we're not so postmodern to say that events don't exist, but events exist on a timeline. Think of a hurricane in the era of climate change. Think of a school that burns down in a wildfire season in the era of climate change. We have all of these temporalities that are intermingled now. I mean, this is, to me, is such an exciting part of where our work is going. Cascading disaster, compound disaster, looking at the interlinkages and then tracing them over time. But disaster recovery, if you ask the emergency manager in the United States, the recovery is complete when the funding is done. But if you ask the community member, is the recovery complete? They will tell you many different things. They might tell you yes to get you to leave them alone. But if you look around their property, if they talk to you about their mental health challenges, if they talk about people who left the community and never came back, we will know that recovery is a longer term process. What I've been focusing on in more recent years is memorialization and memory work, not as some kind of add-on or some kind of soft space, but actually as a real important tool to increase risk management, knowledge, disaster preparedness, and a real important form of listening to and working with disaster-affected communities. In the United States, memorialization is often treated as something that will have to come later when the real work of disaster preparedness or recovery is done. And there's usually no money appropriated, and so the family members have to become lawyers, architects, fundraisers. In the worst moments of their life, they have to set up nonprofit corporations and build huge structures, or society moves on and forgets their story. I think we can do better than that. So there's a politics of slow disaster, there's a politics of remembering, and of course, politics of forgetting, too. Those things which are forgotten at the societal level or your own personal level, I mean, that if we trace that back, it may seem like a bit of a conundrum. Think about the things you've forgotten. But I think about that sometimes if you're writing a book, particularly a long project, and you come back to your original notes, and say, look at the things I've forgotten. Look at the many things I left along the way. Why did I forget them? Why was my interest starting here and moved to another place? I draw inspiration here from Robert Lifton. Some of you may know Lifton's work. He died just last year at the age of 100. He was still producing books up to the end of his life. Lifton's first major book, Death in Life, was the first English-language large-scale set of interviews with hibakusha, survivors of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. And Lifton introduced concepts like survivor guilt, for example. I mean, it was Lifton who made a commitment and went back and did follow-up interviews with this community over long periods of time and thought seriously about the ways that memory and trauma reduction and listening and memorial are all imbricated together. And so he rejected the idea that the bombing was over on August 7th, 1945. He rejected the idea that it was over when the memorial park was opened. To Robert Lifton, to the end of his life, and I'm persuaded by this, the bombing is not over. The radiation effects research lab is still there in Hiroshima. Those people who survived are still subjects of medical inquiry, and they also have their own stories to tell. You may be aware that, to me, one of the most extraordinary oral history programs in the world is a program that matches up grandchildren with grandparents, hibakusha. Why? Because it's hard to talk to your parents, that's a universal. But also this attempt to capture the stories before those people do finally leave. Many of you are already working in slow disaster work. If you've sort of brought on board the Anthropocene framework and the often reproduced great acceleration graphs here, these are just the Earth system trends. I mean, all the trends more or less are up since the 1950s. And this work, I think, actually fits very well with the kind of slow disaster and memory work that I'm suggesting to you, because this is the backdrop against which disasters are accelerating. These are the planetary, technical, and scientific conditions. And our challenge, I think your challenge in the PEPR risk program, will be to take something like this and then put it in a place and put stories in it. Let this be one mode of persuasion, but then use the other modes of persuasion that are available to you. I'll take my remaining time here to talk concretely about a project that I created with colleagues, graduate students in South Korea when I was working at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology the last 5 years. We created a program called Disaster Hakyo. The Hakyo is a school, that's Korean for school. It's meant to be a school in which the curriculum is very much always in development. And the core principle we had here was mutual aid. That we would not do research on communities, we would do research with communities. And we would actually only go to locations and sites where we had pre-existing relationships. And there were a few of those around South Korea. This is how we met Ji-sung Lee. This is how we began to work with the Sewol Ferry bereaved family community. And we sat down and we developed the curriculum of this school. We put up the invitation. I didn't know if anyone would apply. We had over 100 applications from around the world. We had artists, we had scholars, people like us here in this room. We had scientists and engineers, a very broad range of folks from most continents, not all. And we held 3 of these over 3 years. First one in South Korea alone. The second one, we traveled from South Korea to Japan. And actually, we looked at classrooms. We looked at classrooms as sites of refuge, of study, and of memorial. And then the third one we did on the 10th anniversary of the Sewol Ferry disaster. And so these themes, slowing down the research, doing it in participatory action style, mutual aid philosophy, working against the backdrop of the Anthropocene, and attempting to move from the is to the ought. And that's a controversial move sometimes. Many of us are more comfortable in the data set than we are talking about why we do the data set. But we all have a set of values that motivate our work. Disaster justice can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. We ask the question. The bereaved families that we had the honor to work with, what does justice look like to you? What will close this disaster for you, if anything, ever will? Here I shamelessly promote my own work, but actually it's mostly the work of my brilliant former students Joel Champalet, Hyuna Kyum, Solgi Lee, and Hyunbin Park. And we wrote this article, which is available, open access. If you want to know more about what Disaster Hakyo is, it has English and Korean names. I think we could put a French name on there. I'd be happy with that. I want to continue to use the form. I think we need as much methodological creativity as we can possibly muster at this moment. The opportunity is here, and I know this feels like a tough moment. War, austerity, anti-science, that's actually why we can rise in this moment, to do this work. Podcast, filmmaking, interdisciplinary teams, slow disaster, Anthropocene work. Let's use all of these tools. And as I close, I want to close at a beginning point, because I could have started my introductions to Ji-sung Lee and Gonzalo Basclupe in a different way. I started very much in the midst of the disaster as it intersected with their life. But if you know something a little bit about Korean history, you're aware of the long history of colonial torment and state violence in South Korea at the hands of many governments, including their own government. In 1980, the Gwangju Uprising saw as many as 2,000 people killed in the city of Gwangju, democracy protesters. If you talk with bereaved families in South Korea about the collapse of the Sampung department store or the Halloween mass, the killing of many people on Halloween a few years ago when they were gathered together in a tight spot in Seoul, or the Sewol Ferry, the conversation will come back to Gwangju. Why? Because this is the continuum. This is the slow disaster. Why do they care so much? Why do any of us care so much if the government fails to protect? Because we have expectations. There's a social contract. Things are said about what democracy is. And for this is the moment in which democracy seemed impossible. And now that they've got a democracy, they fight, as you know their recent history, they fight very hard to keep it. As Gonzalo and I talked more about the painting, I asked him about the colors. And I asked him about the problem of names in Chilean history. And he said, yeah, this is about COVID, but this is also about the dictatorship. This is about Pinochet. This is about the desert. This is about people whose names we don't know. This is about numbers and counting. About sometimes the only thing you have is the ability to write a number, put it on a canvas, and make that your statement. This is risk management. This is a way to tell a story across time that moves in another dimension than just quantities or qualities that we might ordinarily use. Jisong Lee, I think she won't mind if I tell you right now, the memory classroom is being considered by UNESCO for inclusion in the Memory of the World program. What an extraordinary journey to go from saying goodbye to a child and then realizing the child is not coming home, to demanding an investigation, actually 3 separate technical investigations, and then when the families got irritated, they did their own investigation, and then creating an archive, a memory space, a curriculum, participating with professors, taking too much of their time to work together on disaster Hakyo, and now in a couple of months she'll go to Indonesia and make the case for the inclusion of her work in this memory archive. She's a strategist. She's a bereaved family member. She's a colleague. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, very much for this invitation to travel on time. But it's an invitation that it was really original, because this was an invitation not to travel between the past and the future, but most to consider that change means as well a back and forth between past, present, and future. So thank you so much for this. And now the floor will be for Takako Izumi, who is professor for the International Research Institute of Disaster Science and as well at the International Environment and Disaster Management Research at the Tohoku University. She's as well program director of the multi-hazard program under the Association of Pacific Rim Universities. And she holds a PhD in global environmental study, and she's as well the author of so many publications in the field of disaster. Thank you so much. Welcome to be here.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Tania, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm from the International Research Institute of Disaster Science under Tohoku University in Japan. So Tohoku University is located in Sendai City, which were hit very severely by the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami in 2011. So today, I would like to talk about advancing disaster risk reduction through science-society integration, mainly focusing on lessons from the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. So now it has been already 15 years after the tragic event. So we talk about the reconstruction, especially the infrastructure's reconstruction has finished, but the actual and real recovery is not finished, and it's still ongoing. So our research institute, it's shortened IRIDIS. It's established in April 2012. So 1 year after the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. Although, of course, the impact and influence of this event pushed really strongly to establish this research institute, but it has been a long discussion to build this institute, so that this is not only reason, the disaster is not the only reason to establish our research institute. So you can see Sendai is quite a northern part of Japan located. But from Tokyo, it takes only 1.5 by boat train. Then keywords and also main focus of our research institute is that multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. I think we heard this word so much during this workshop and also the event, but our research institute is combination of different backgrounds such as humanities, science and natural science, social sciences, engineering, and medicine, and we all tried working together. And also another big objective is that to maximize the practical use of research findings. Of course, our main work is to produce papers and books and publications. However, we think we try to maximize the results and findings to reflect the actual use at the local level. So these are the two keywords of our research institute. So now we have nearly 200 faculty and staff members in IRIDIS, and mostly, but full-time faculty is nearly probably 60 to 70. Then as you can see, different divisions on the right side, and risk evaluation and disaster mitigation research division, and also the humanity and social sciences, and medical science, and practical research and collaboration division, etc. So we try to work together for the international interdisciplinary research. However, it's not really easy. As all you know, we try and we are aiming for conducting all this kind of research, but actually it's not really easy. So now I'd like to talk about this disaster a little bit. So this happened almost 15 years ago, and magnitude was 9.0, the earthquake, and it caused a huge tsunami. Then Fukushima nuclear power plant accident. So the highest tsunami, it reached 20 meters, so which is completely beyond our expectation. So we have never thought the tsunami hit these areas can beyond nearly probably 10 meters, but actually this is really, really much more than we expected. And approximately to 20,000 people's lives were lost. And of course, the tragic is that what happened in Fukushima, and Daiichi nuclear power plant accident. Then the total financial damage is the USD $169 billion. So it's really huge economic loss as well. So the question is, why were the impacts of the 2011 disaster so severe? So there are a couple of, the reasons, but of course, what I introduced now is not everything, but some of them I can highlight. So first is the extreme hazard beyond assumptions. As I mentioned, the tsunami more than or nearly 20 meters, we never thought it will come and it will hit our areas. So that tsunami risk scenarios were largely based on historical probability, because we have never suffered from such a huge tsunami. So that based on our experience, we thought the maximum we can be hit will be probably less than 20 meters. Then infrastructure design standards did not fully incorporate the maximum credible events. So that what we had in risk governance at that time was grounded in probabilistic planning rather than extreme event preparedness. So we never thought we have to prepare for considering such a extreme event. And second is infrastructure-centric protection model. So heavy reliance on seawalls and coastal defenses. So we already constructed some of the seawall on the seacoast in this Tohoku region, so that people thought they heard the alert and warnings, and they felt like they were safe because they were protected by this kind of a great infrastructure, seawalls. So they thought they don't have to take that kind of actions like evacuation. So they really believed and trusted that infrastructure. Then structural protection created a perception of safety. So this kind of physical defense reduced frequent risk, but amplified vulnerability under catastrophic conditions. And third is cascading systemic failure. So now we hear quite many times about cascading and also the systemic risks. But before, of course, there are some discussions about this, but it's not really often like we hear now. So in 2011, of course, earthquake caused tsunami and tsunami caused a nuclear accident. But we never thought at the end, tsunami or earthquake will cause such a tragic nuclear power plant accident. But now the TEPCO, which manages this nuclear power plant, they officially admitted the cause of this tragic accident is that lack of preparation. So this nuclear accident was caused by basically the flood and water, not the earthquake. So that if they could take any preparedness action towards the flood, maybe this kind of tragic accident was avoided. Then social vulnerability and risk perception factors. One is a demographic vulnerability. So as I mentioned, Sendai is located northern part of Japan, which is a little bit facing to the population decline and also the aging society. So there are high population of the aging, there are high aging population on the seacoast, and also limited evacuation support systems, especially for vulnerable residents. So this kind of social structure and demographic and significantly shaped disaster, this kind of tragic end outcomes. Then also some gaps between risk communication and behaviors. So initial tsunami height was underestimated, so that the people received warning and alerts was that really it was not really accurate tsunami height. Then delayed or hesitant evacuation in some communities because of this underestimation. And inconsistent understanding of warning messages. Sometimes it confuses people, even though they receive the signs and alert, sometimes confused people what kind of action they should take. Does that mean we need to take an immediate action, or we can still wait until another signs? So this kind of communication was not really clear. So that information delivery did not always translate into immediate protective action. So that key lessons for future disaster risk reduction based on this 2011 event. First, extreme events can exceed assumptions. As I already mentioned, we really need to prepare for worst case scenario, not only rely on our experiences in the past. The next is, it's very important to have the mixed preparedness, evacuation or preparedness culture, and also the infrastructure as well. So DRR, disaster risk reduction, requires a balance between structural measures and non-structural measures. Then we cannot forget about cascading and systemic risk as well. So we had to shift from the single hazard approach to all hazards or systemic approaches. The next is science, policy, society interface. So we have very good technology and innovation and science as well, but whether it is really communicated to the people, it is really used at the local level. So even though we have a very advanced warning and alert and early warning signs, however, it doesn't convince or it doesn't encourage people to take an evacuation action, then what's the point to have that kind of advanced early warning systems? Then last is recovery is long-term and multi-dimensional. So reconstruction work is not only the infrastructure, but rather we also think about the people's life and livelihood and economy, and also demographic decline as well, and as well as mental health. And all these comprehensive recovery is very important after such a big disaster. So now I would like to talk about what changed after the Great East Japan earthquake in disaster risk reduction. Of course, we had such a big experiences and lessons learned, and we should change or we should improve our disaster risk reduction in the last 15 years. So that based on the lessons learned, what we have changed is that we have currently the planning for maximum credible events. And I will come back later on a little bit more elaborate. And the second is community-based disaster governance. Of course, we had this one before, even the 2011, but we really strengthened this part, community-based, not really government or oriented. Then third is stronger science policy society interface. Then last is the evacuation-centered disaster preparedness and combination of structural and non-structural measures. So first is from assumption-based planning to extreme risk preparedness. So before, as I mentioned, we already had good structural defenses like seawall. But after 2011, we decided to have two levels of infrastructure preparedness. And we call L1 is to prepare for the frequent events. And L2 is maximum credible, low frequency, extreme events. So to tackle L2, before we had, for example, only the seawall, single seawall near the seacoast. But now we have the system, it's called multiple defenses, like this picture, and we have the seawall, then behind we have trees, and we have elevated highways and bridges. Then we relocated to the mountainside, the residential areas. We relocated these areas into the mountainside, so that it's called the multiple defenses. So to tackle that kind of extreme events, we changed a little bit about urban planning and design as well. So we see it as from infrastructure dominant risk mitigation to human capacity building and institutionalized community-based disaster governance. So we try to focus more about capacity building of through the education, disaster education, and or awareness events. Then second is from centralized governance to community inclusive disaster risk reduction. So the example is that we changed some policies. So one is that it's called the Disaster Countermeasures Basic Act. It was enacted in 1965. It's quite a long, it was quite an old law, but we changed it or we improved it and include some elements to establish registries for people requiring evacuation assistance, or strengthening logistics and emergency supply systems, then improved coordination and information sharing among the national and local governments. And also this act newly encouraged to develop the regional disaster management plan. So before, usually the national government is lead disaster risk reduction and response and recovery efforts. But currently, the localization is happening so that each municipalities were asked to develop and establish some regional disaster risk reduction plan as well. Then after that, we created the district disaster management plan system as well. So that this includes the mandatory evacuation support lists for vulnerable populations. So that this is to encourage the sort of individual and also neighboring support, not only rely on the government as well. So that by having this kind of list, people will know who will require the assistance for evacuation. Of course, we have to be careful about the privacy issues, but still this kind of actions are quite important to provide the support to the people who needs the support in case of the evacuation action, taking evacuation action. So that even through this kind of regulations and policies, we really strengthen the support at the community levels. Then next is the Science Policy Society interface. So even before, there is a very strong collaboration between the science and policies, and even before 2011. But after that, we again really realized we need to strengthen to include some science aspects into the policy. So we believe now there are so many things needs to be done. In first thing is greater emphasis on integrating scientific evidence into risk governance. As I mentioned, there are so many developments in science and technology in disaster risk reduction, but the question is whether it was used in the actual policies or risk governance or risk assessment as well. So that we try to the strengthen the interface and also the linkage between science and policies as well. Then increased focus on risk communication and public dialogue. It is also the very important part in risk communication and public dialogue. As I mentioned, warning signs in very advanced early warning system itself is not enough, but rather we have to think about how these signs can change people's behaviors and actions. Then more transparency in communicating uncertainty and risk information. Then lastly, greater use of scientific knowledge in local disaster planning and hazard mapping. So we changed sort of the hazard mapping after 2011, including more accurate modeling and simulation exercise. Then it was communicated into and shared with the communities. So a little bit more details and lessons for science policy society interface from the Great East Japan earthquake, because academia, it's very important how to connect to be the policy makers and also how to change the current, the behavior and also the policies. First, definitely scientific knowledge must be linked to local action. Through hazard mapping, evacuation planning, and community preparedness, we really need to work together with the community level. And I believe it is very important. It is our responsibility. Then co-production of knowledge is essential. Now, when we talk about the strengthen disaster management plan or disaster risk reduction plan, it's very important to work together, scientists, policymakers, communities, and private sector. Then enhancing risk communication, as I already mentioned, is so important. And we have to strengthen community discussions and evacuation planning. Then integration of scientific knowledge into local disaster management. So this kind of activities have been done in our areas, and our institute and university is really try to involve in the process of developing the evacuation planning and local disaster management. So interactive risk communication and co-production of knowledge is really important. So as I mentioned, and we are really trying to develop a community evacuation mapping together with communities, and through expected tsunami inundation areas, evacuation routes, and locations of safe shelters. So all these factors and elements are included in the newly developed hazard maps. And now, then, I'd like to see a little bit more broadened picture how made the impact of these lessons learned also experienced at the global level. So in 2011, and lessons learned from such complex disasters, and the very important points, and I'd like to highlight, is again, extreme events can exceed design assumptions, and infrastructure alone cannot ensure safety, and cascading and systemic risks can occur, and risk communication and science policy coordinations are very crucial. So that's one of the important lessons learned from 2011. And scientific knowledge must be better connected to policy decisions and public communications. So this is a strong and key message from academic side. Then, as you know, 2015, there is such a big event. It's called the UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, and which is also organized in Sendai City. So at that time, this, as you have seen, as you have heard, Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction was adopted. Then this framework includes emphasis on understanding disaster risk and the stronger role of science and technology. As you can see in the document, they really enhance and emphasize the role of science and technology. Then promotion of multi-stakeholder engagement and participation of all the stakeholders. Then integration with sustainable development and climate policy. So these are the main things highlighted in Sendai Framework. So still, we can see the very strong highlight of the science policy society interface. Then now, the global transformation of disaster risk reduction following the Sendai Framework. So scientific communities became more involved in disaster risk reduction governance. So this is the international level and initiatives, but UN formed, it's called Science Technology Advisory Group under this UNDRR, so that they really would like to hear some comments and also the inputs from the science communities towards the strengthening the disaster risk reduction. Then global disaster loss database was expanded, and early warning systems was improved worldwide, and risk governance increasingly address systemic and cascading risks. So we really see clearly the shift from disaster response to disaster risk management to resilience building. So that it's a very at a glance of the international level, what we can see. However, of course, implementation is completely different issue. These are some points we really understand as important and critical points, but there is so much gaps in between the what we are aiming for and implementation. So that towards the 2030 post-Sender framework, we really need to work together to achieve all these goals, I believe. So now, the second part, I'd like to introduce what I lead in current university. It's called Association of Pacific Rim Universities. It's a network of universities, so that I'm sure in Europe there are so many university networks, but this is the network from Asian side. So I hope this can be a little bit as an example of a network. So we have 61 research universities in Asia and Pacific, but that includes also it's called Pacific Rim. So it includes also the west coast of the United States and also Latin America. Then we totally have the 61 universities, and what we are doing is that we have, it's called programs under this network, and each program is led by different universities. For example, the program is called Multi-Hazard, is led by Tohoku University, and I am the program director. So in addition to multi-hazard program, we have different type of program under this network. For example, digital economy and sustainable cities and landscape, and also the Pacific Ocean and biodiversity. So each program is led by different university. So under the multi-hazards program, which Tohoku University is leading, we are aiming for, our focus is a research, education for resilience, and impact and advocacy. So of course, and there are some limitations what we can do, but at least we are really trying to, build the capacity of young researchers, and they also provide a lot of opportunities to share their research results, and also try to make some impact and advocacy at the international level. So for research wise, and we try to publish a lot of books together, and also we managed to issue a journal, international journal. It's called Progress in Disaster Science. It's published by Elsevier. Then education-wise, and we organize the multi-hazard summer school every year in Tohoku University, so that if you are really interested in, and I really encourage you to join us in this summer school. It's a 4-day programs. Then one day we include a field visit to the affected site. So after Great East Japan earthquake, we built so many museums and parks and memorials to remember what happened, and also it's for educational purposes. So this is quite short, 4 days, but I believe it's quite a good program. And a lot of participants say, of course, the field visit is a probably most memorable part for them. Then we organize the annual research symposium, and each member university will host this symposium every year. Then nearly 150 people gathered, and we try to share our research results and try to build a new network among their new researchers. Then we also organize a webinar series from time to time and on the different topics. Then impact and advocacy, we try to join opportunities organized by UN or together with other international organizations. Then recent And also our workshop, it's called Localizing Disaster Risk Reduction Strategies in Asia and the Pacific, and also All Hazard Approach, and hosted by Tohoku University. So this kind of thematic workshops are also organized through this network. Then this is some examples of the webinar series, and we invited different academia and researchers into each webinar series. So that includes the variety of different topics related to the disaster risk reduction. So these are the other events, like an annual symposium and international conference together with the ADB or other international organizations. So as I mentioned, there's limitation what we can do in this kind of network, but still there's so many things we can benefit from the collaboration among academia. So I hope, and we can also learn about networks and collaboration among academia, and compared to, not compared, but through collaboration with Europe and also Japan. And that's all for my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Takako. And now I invite Scott to join us here to take some minutes for discussion, and take Takako for this presentation that remind at least, I think, 2 elements that we are discussing since yesterday, please. Yes. And the first is the importance of risk communication, and the second that I identify, it's at least, and that is more new regarding that we discussed yesterday, is the issue of the extent and the impact of the international public policy related with disaster risk reduction. We have here with this presentation many new elements that are maybe helping us to think a little bit more about this more implementation perspective that is really presented in the Takako presentation. So now the floor is open for questions. We can take one then.
Jean-Marc Tacnay, INRAE. I would have a question to Takako. You said that you changed the way you address events after the event in 2011, moving from addressing frequent events and then maximum events. And my question is, how was it implemented in practice in other places, and how is it accepted? Because you have always a problem of if you improve and you take bigger events, then it's more expensive, etc. How was it accepted and implemented?
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's still probably limited in Tohoku area, because we could make this kind of change because of our experience. So other areas and parts of Japan have not experienced this kind of tragic event, then probably it's really difficult to change their mindset. But another thing is that we have some, prediction. In 20 years, we will have another big earthquake in the west part of Japan, and not really the north part, but west part of Japan. So we have a very strong warning in 20 years or 30 years. So in that part, we really, I believe we really strengthened the preparedness activities. Even what happened is that even they relocated people already in advance, so that the people who lived in the seacoast, already they sort of evacuated or relocated in the higher ground. So we call it an pre-relocation. So that kind of very active in actions were taken already, not only the infrastructure building, but rather really active preparedness work. But once again, this kind of change of the mindset in preparedness is not happening entire Japan, not yet. It's probably only the East Coast. But as long as we have some alert and warning for the future disasters, then we are really promoting the importance of the active disaster preparedness, and based on our experiences in Sendai and northern part of Japan.
Thank you. I think that there was another question. Yes, please.
Annabelle Moiti, ASNR. Thank you for both of your communications. I have a question for Takako, which is kind of linked with the previous question, but also with the intervention of Scott regarding the fact that at least at individual level, post-disaster recovery can be a never-ending process. It's very long in time. Can you elaborate a bit regarding the relocation process in Sendai, regarding the time it lasts to relocate the people from the seaside to go to the hills and to build these multiple protections? And do you have informations on what are the consequences for the individuals, for people, of this relocation regarding access to resources or to their land attachment or this kind of quality of life elements? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Relocation process is really complicated. So it depends on probably the city and town. So a relocation plan has been implemented by usually the city or the towns. So they have really facing different challenges and issues. And one of the cities who take very active relocation plan, and also it seems quite succeeded, is that the city is quite unique because they decided not to have the seawall. They are really the towns near the sea coast, and most of the towns and cities near the sea coast, they decided to build such a high seawalls to protect their the future lives. But one city, they decided not to build seawall because they thought to relocate the community itself to the mountainside is the best decision. So this kind of city was probably not really, it's not really difficult to make the decision to relocation because there are two choices whether they should have such a high seawall or to be relocated. And this city chose to be relocated. So this is one example, but other example is that there are so many different things, and some cities were they had decided to have high seawalls plus relocation. But after they decided to relocate, then the families and the people who are really actually relocated were quite few families. And before they do the relocate, they actually move out from the city. So the towns, actually, they have such a big seawalls, but only few families relocated and safely, so that basically behind the seawalls, there is no towns and people to be protected, which is sort of the waste of infrastructure. So that's very sad to see, although we see such a big seawall, but there's no houses and residents behind the seawalls. So, so there are so many that kind of stories. So it's a little bit difficult to explain and generalize all this process. But after 15 years, finally we have so many lessons learned about relocation, because we see there are some cities very successful, but there are some cities not successful. Although this decision made by communities, but still they are not really happy after 15 years. So yes, it's a little bit complicated, but there's different stories, and there are so many things we can learn from that experience as well.
Takako's addressing relocation as a sort of state policy. There's not many successful examples of it that I'm aware of, and it often creates a sort of dual problem. The people who relocate have public health across the board, they have public health vulnerabilities, but then the people who stay behind, their community is now depopulated and affects the schools, the churches, the hospitals, and so on. I mean, this has been very much in the United States when we used to acknowledge that climate change is real. It's been solved in the United States, luckily, so we don't have to deal with climate change anymore, I guess. But there was a strong effort 10 years ago to actually get whole communities to take public funds to relocate in advance of hurricanes and storm surge. So I think that was an important moment, which we shouldn't lose historically. It's probably important that we go back and look, because a lot of effort was done in that planning. And yeah, I think that's a historical moment we shouldn't lose entirely.
Any other question? Yes, please. And then another.
Yes, it's really an open question. Do you think it can exist a contradiction between living with memories and extreme events and free will and freedom?
So the question is, can we both live, can we be free and live with our memories? Yeah. So I very much value the question. And once I gave a presentation similar to this, and a mental health professional came to me after and said, "Why do you want people to keep remembering traumatic events?" And so I think it has to be an individual's choice. You know, and in fact, I guess, as you know, to think about your question, the traditional memorialization efforts are often they're often perceived by communities as quite oppressive. They're totalizing. I'm thinking now of like war memorials and other kinds of large-scale memorials that get built. Juries of architects say this reflects what the community wants. You know, sometimes those instruments are, you know, the intent is good, but you know, to have the president come once a year or once every 5 years and lay a wreath is a kind of continuing the disaster in some ways. So I think what's important from a research perspective, as I would see it, is really to try to look in a much more local, organic, community level. That's why I think the memory classroom is quite important. The community in Ansan, the government, did not want the memory classroom to exist. They thought it would be too expensive to maintain. And so the families just did it on their own. So they've chosen to remember in this way. And I guess the last thing I'd say to that is I have asked, once enough time has gone by, some of the bereaved families, do you intend to maintain this forever? Because there's a lot of tension between the generation of the parents and the generation of the teenagers. And I don't have the answer to that, but I will tell you that very few of the survivors have taken a real interest in maintaining the memory classroom. So it may be that memory itself is also one piece of the slow disaster unfolding, and it's put aside. That will be for them to decide, I think.
Takako, would you like to add something about it? No? Okay. I think that we have another.
You don't want to talk
there.
about free will and.
I mean, that's your expertise. So there's nothing
So you mentioned that you've worked with artists and people of different fields, and you've also mentioned how disaster has like this sort of cycle. Where do you think the arts contribute? Where do you think they're more important in that entire process? And which forms of, I guess, artistic medium would you think are more important now in remembering disasters and perhaps working towards recovery as well?
Thank you. All of it, all the time, right? And I say that just because, I mean, talking about the Sewol alone, family members have produced very local artistic works in memorial spaces. They've written plays, they've written novels, they write music. And actually, if you look deeper into history, there's some continuity here to those cultural practices, which maybe sometimes they even become disassociated from the disaster, but they persist over long periods of time, which I think is quite interesting. I guess one area I'm quite interested in, curious what you think about this, that during COVID, when artistic production was not able to go forward, at least for the couple of years, in the normal way, how much memorial work and artistic memorial work moved online. And I found that, like many of you, there was a salvation in that. I mean, there was a lot of hope in that, but it was so ephemeral. And now it's actually hard to track down a lot of that work. And so that seems like a real opportunity, low cost, ultimately participatory, you know, DIY through distance art making, but you run the risk that then when the same forces of closure can close the art. And I'm aware of some artists who've tried to make that leap from the online space to the physical space after COVID. We could talk more about it after, but great question, thanks.
Would you like to add something? Any other question? Yes, Niels.
Thank you very much for your really, really fascinating talks. I was wondering about what you last said, Scott, about the memory culture, because I think there are two dimensions of visibility of memorialization. Can be an instrumental one where you look at memory as a tool for future disaster risk reduction, and then there's the memory of past as a kind of post-traumatic work. You said that in the Korean case, people more or less self-funded this memory. So I was wondering about the class issue here, because of course, if you got the money to do that, that's easy. But as you know better than I do, that's usually quite unequally distributed. So how, especially in the French context, I'm wondering about that, because when we are starting to discuss with local actors about initiatives that include the population, the question of funding is discussed in that very ambiguous way of, if we ask citizens to do something the state should do or could do, or other public actors like cities or municipalities, then we make work them for free for something the public authorities should do. So how do you tackle with that tension?
It's a very important question, and maybe just to be more clear about it, the early days of memorialization in Ansan was all, probably wasn't free, but it was very low cost. I mean, even the dismantling and the moving of the classroom was done by families. They held a ceremony and they moved it, and they put it in a temporary space that the city gave them. But I think one of the things that's brilliant about the memory classroom is it actually is maintained by families. The aesthetic is the aesthetic that the families want. It does have some state support, but not a lot. I mean, this is a low-cost venture with a very high impact. And let me add one thing to that. They're still waiting for the formal memorial paid for by the government. The Life and Safety Park, which will also be built in Ansan, has broken ground. I think I've lost track how many times it's broken ground. And then when the government has shifted back and forth, they defund it. So it's funded when there's a liberal government, it's defunded when there's a conservative government. They're breaking ground again now, or the ground is broken. So I don't think you would need me to explain. I think the families themselves are quite aware of the financial politics of memory. It's like ties back to the last question that we do have more opportunities now to make memorial artifacts and objects that can travel much further than they would have in the past using new media. And I think that's a really important, interesting mode to follow.
Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. I think that we need to move to the conclusive session, but I would like really to thank you, both of presenters, because it was really stimulating. Thank you very much.